What is up, guys? Blue here. Before the video starts, I just wanted to let you guys know that this week they're doing some internet maintenance stuff and upgrading the internet in my area, I guess. I recorded a few videos in advance for that, but because of the Reddit shutdowns going on right now, I haven't been able to find any stories for tonight. So this video tonight is just kind of going to be a best of the last month's stories, I guess. I'm going to look around for some other sources for stories, so hopefully we should only have to do that tonight. If you guys don't like that, then feel free to skip this one, but if you don't mind, then I hope you guys enjoy the video as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will let you enjoy your video now. I think my mom must have been bullied or something when she was growing up. I mean, she never really told me as much, but for some reason, she had an awful lot of empathy for one kid in my class that was bullied. Although I didn't even really like him that much, she pretty much forced me to hang out with this guy. His name was Colin, and she made me do it all the time. He didn't really have any friends, so she kinda took it upon herself to force me to be one. She even once made me sleep over at his house. Colin was just kinda weird. He talked to himself a lot and answered himself as well. It made us all think he must be really crazy or something. My other friends gave me a ton of grief for hanging out with him, but what could I do really? I always did what my mom asked of me, even if it wasn't something I really cared to do. When Colin asked me to sleep over at his place, I was unfortunate enough to have my mom in the same room as us. She overheard and answered for me right away. So here I was, losing an entire Saturday night, sleeping over at this weird kid's house. Colin's parents were a bit odd too. They must have known how few friends he had, because they seemed super appreciative I was even hanging out with them at all. They kept on thanking me and offering me anything I wanted to eat. They even let me choose what to watch on television. They just kinda did whatever they could to show me how much they appreciated I was his friend, which meant they probably didn't know he was simply a charity case. When we went to bed, I noticed that Colin had bunk beds. However, rather than take the top bunk, he instead chose to sleep on the floor. When I asked him why, he told me this: "I always have to save the top bunk for the other Colin." When I asked him what he was talking about, he just shrugged and ignored me. He curled up in a sleeping bag and went right to sleep. Well, I'm not really sure how I could possibly fall asleep after hearing that, but eventually I did manage to. I woke up though sometime in the middle of the night when I heard some ominous whispering. Without raising out of bed, I opened my eyes and looked over at Colin. He was sitting up in his sleeping bag, rocking back and forth. While he rocked, he kept on whispering unintelligible things. I was used to knowing that this kid talked to himself all the time, but this was so much creepier. He just kept on whispering, all while dramatically swaying forwards and backwards on the floor. My God, I thought to myself, something really is wrong with this guy. I closed my eyes and tried to make myself fall back asleep. Somehow I managed to once again. The next time I woke up though, it was unclear at first as to what had woken me up. It was still dark when I opened my eyes, but I almost jumped out of my skin. Colin was sitting right at the edge of the bed, staring over me with a huge smile on his face. I asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't answer me. He just sat there and continued to stare. He didn't even blink a single time. I kept asking him if something was wrong, but he just smiled and didn't seem to have any clue I was trying to interact with him. I closed my eyes and prayed this was just a dream. While I laid there, I honestly felt this kid was some sort of psychotic or something. I didn't really know what I could do. If I told his parents I wanted to go home, well, what could I tell them that would convince them to let me? My mom, of course, would also be pissed at me for not spending the entire night. With how she acted, you can of course imagine that she wouldn't believe a single thing I told her. She'd just think I was prejudging the poor kid like everyone else did. I closed my eyes for a long time, trying to ignore everything and imagine it was just a dream. If I ever did fall back asleep, it surely wasn't a restful one. although I can't remember doing so. What caused me to finally open my eyes once again, though, was a kicking sound on the top bunk. I thought to myself that Colin must have climbed up on top because this other Colin he had mentioned made him. I heard 10 kicks before I started to get annoyed. I opened my eyes and shouted for him to stop. "Stop what?" Colin groggily asked me. I froze when I noticed the voice was coming from the floor. I looked over and saw Colin was sleeping in a sleeping bag. I immediately jumped out of the bed, almost like how someone would jump away from a spider or something. I didn't see anyone on the top bunk, though. Colin shook his head, and he seemed to immediately understand. "Oh, just go back to bed. I think he'll leave you alone now." I didn't want to get back in that bed. I chose to sleep on the floor far away from everything. I tried to get Colin to talk about what that was, but he just fell asleep and refused to talk to me. I couldn't fall asleep at all, though. I laid there all night, looking at the top bunk and wondering what just happened. I can't claim that my memory of what happened that night is perfect, though. There's a possibility that Colin's weird behavior before simply made me imagine the sounds. I don't really know, but I can sure as hell tell you that I stopped hanging out with Colin, even though my mom did get really pissed with me. When I was 12, I had a really scary encounter when I was spending the night at my friend Jenny's house. It was a Friday night. Although it was set up as a supervised sleepover with Jenny's mom there, at about 8 p.m., her mom got called into work suddenly. She was a nurse, so it wasn't really unusual for this to happen, and it wasn't unusual either for Jenny to spend a lot of time home alone, even at her young age. Jenny's mom just gave us the normal rules. Stay up on the second floor as much as possible, and if anyone comes to the door, just pretend that no one was home. We didn't mind having the place to ourselves for many reasons, least of all that we were able to stay up as late as we wanted and do whatever we wanted to do. Around 10 p.m., we were still up in Jenny's room watching television when we heard someone ringing the doorbell. We weren't really expecting to hear that so late at night. Of course, we were very curious as to who this could possibly be. We also knew what the rules were, though, so we didn't just go to answer the door right away. It was hard not to, because whoever it was kept ringing the bell over and over again, very frantically. It was nearly 5 minutes of ringing before it stopped as abruptly as it had started. We were both still very curious as to who the hell that was, but now we didn't really concern ourselves too much. That is, until about half an hour later, when the doorbell began to frantically ring again. It startled us, as we hadn't expected the person to come back. Even this time, the doorbell rang over and over again for nearly 15 minutes. It was unnerving. I'm not even sure if I can tell you exactly how it felt. It was nerve-wracking to hear the doorbell over and over again, knowing we couldn't go down to answer the door no matter what. Honestly, we didn't even think it was a good idea to sneak a peek out the window and see who it was, just on the off chance they might see us. We also couldn't make the ringing stop, and we really wanted it to. When it finally did stop for the second time, we were already so wound up that it was hard for us to relax. Jenny tried calling her mom, but being a nurse, it was very often difficult to get in touch with her while she was working. We left a message for her to get back with us as soon as she could, but there was really no telling when that might be. For a while afterwards, we were just very uneasy, but the ringing did not come again. I can't explain why we felt like that, other than it was simply the fact we didn't know who it was that was driving us crazy. At some point, I began to get very thirsty. It must have been the nerves from what was happening, but I felt my mouth getting drier and drier until I knew I would have to go downstairs and grab something to drink. By the time me and her finally braved the trip downstairs together, it had been nearly an hour and a half since the second time we'd heard the doorbell ring. Walking down the stairs was a bit of a chore. With every step, I expected the doorbell to suddenly start ringing again, or for something to jump out in front of us and grab our feet as we were walking down. We, however, made it all the way down to the bottom without a single incident. Finally realizing that whoever it was must be long gone and we were surely safe, Jenny and I went into the kitchen, grabbed ourselves a drink, and took a couple of minutes to make a snack. We were soon about to get ready to head back upstairs. I noticed, though, that Jenny had stopped now. She was looking right past me at the back door. When I turned around, I almost had a heart attack when I saw a man silently standing there, leaning against the window and holding a knife against the window glass. I screamed, but Jenny did the smarter thing. She ran over to the house phone, picked it up, and called 911. "I'm calling the cops, you asshole!" The guy just smiled and pressed his face into the glass. He chuckled, then gave the window a kiss before running off into the night. The police were able to get a hold of Jenny's mom, and she came home, but there was no one anywhere to be found. Seeing that guy was startling enough, but that's not the thing that scared me the most. The thing that terrified me the most was the fact this guy must have not only known we were home, but that we were home alone as well. The ring of the doorbell must have been done deliberately to make us uneasy. How long had he been patiently waiting and watching for us where he was watching from? I don't know. I was stalked by a guest in my student accommodation. I'm 19 years old and living far from home in a studio room. I'm often up late, and last week I was doing some laundry at around 11 p.m.-ish. I saw a man sitting in the lobby. I'd seen him around a bit at night before, but I didn't really ever think too much of him. There I was in the laundry room. I just put my clothes in the dryer, and I heard the laundry room door beeping. That meant someone was currently coming in. There I saw the man, standing there with no clothes to wash, just staring at me from the doorway. I maneuvered around him and headed to the lifts, and he followed quickly behind me. He cornered me and asked me for my Snapchat. I was tired and just wanted to get back to my room, so stupidly, I gave it to him. I figured he'd message and try to flirt, and I'd simply say, "I have a boyfriend. Sorry if you thought this was anything else." Surely that would be the end of it. Anyway, almost right away he started messaging me. It was kind of normal at first. Then he started to say the real weird stuff. "I saw you a month ago, you know. I was really impressed. I've been visiting a friend and staying here so I can see you. I've been watching you. I notice you come out mostly at night. Why is that?" He told me he would be sticking around for 5 more days. Then it started to get worse. "I love you. I can't help it." When I told him I had a boyfriend, he said, "But I only want you." He continued to ignore what I'd said. He asked to come to my room, and I of course said no. Then he asked me to give him a hug. He asked me if I lived alone, if I was a virgin. He kept on repeating that he loved me so much, and he knew I was perfect for him, that I'd really impressed him. At that point, I recorded all the messages I could on Snapchat. I spoke to him a little bit more to gather some evidence so I could take it down to reception in the morning. He'd been watching me for the entire month. I got my friend who lives on the 2nd floor to walk me down to the laundry room, and we sat in the student lounge area. My friend tried to calm me down. I could see him walking around the laundry room, looking for me, but luckily I'd already picked up my things, and he didn't seem to notice me. I ran back to my room. My friend offered me to stay in his room, but I said it was okay since I could just lock my door. At around 1 a.m. though, I heard someone outside my room trying to pick the lock. I asked my friend if he was outside, and he said no. I froze. I didn't want to make a sound. I felt sick to my stomach and helpless. Eventually, when they were unsuccessful, whoever it was took off running. In the morning, I reported this to reception, and then went to stay a few days with my boyfriend. Then after, I went to London to visit a friend. Last night was the first time I'd spent a night in my room since this happened. I'm very paranoid now, and sadly, I should probably be used to this. It's not the first time I've had someone stalk me. One guy even followed me into the club and tried to grab my head, and a bunch of other things have happened as well that I won't go through. Anyway, I'm terrified to go outside my room after dark, and I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling paranoid that man will appear once again. I live in a major metropolitan area, DC, and try to practice keen situational awareness and stay aware of any present danger. Alright, that was putting it lightly. To be honest, I've seen some scary shit and become paranoid as fuck because of it. I'm a fairly petite person already, who's looked 16 for the past decade and is therefore an easy target for creeps. Depending on what part of the city I'm going to, or how late I plan to be out, I sometimes strap a fixed blade to myself. I conceal it under my pants or in my boot in the winter, and in summer I either strap it to my arm or somewhere around my waist. It's not exactly the most comfortable, but you can never be too prepared. It was raining on this night. I was wearing an oversized retro windbreaker that I had just found at the thrift store. The knife was tucked away in my purse. The humid DC summer made my skin sticky, and the thought of having a sheath around my arm was very unappealing. I got onto the metro towards home, but the conductor announced that the train was going to go out of service on the stop just before mine. One of my buddies lived 2 blocks away from that metro stop, so I texted him, seeing if he wanted me to stop by and smoke him up for a bit. He responded, saying he would be on his balcony, and I could stop by and just yell for him to let me into the building whenever I came. On the train, I usually listen to music, read, crochet, or stare out the window with regular intervals of casing the train for any sketchy shit. Once in a blue moon, people get robbed on the metro, and if I see packs of teens or people moving up and down the aisle without sitting down, I pack up and tuck my bag underneath myself. It was right before rush hour, and the train was fairly full this time. I didn't really sense anything unusual until I noticed a guy who looked sort of out of place, sitting just across the aisle and facing me. DC has people from all over, and people rarely, if ever, stand out to me as looking suspicious, but something about this guy was easily triggering my spidey senses. The man was abnormally skinny and had greasy dark hair. Looked sort of Eastern European, I'd guess. He was wearing a purple button-down and some tight pants, and kept talking on the phone while checking another phone in his lap. I speak Spanish and a bit of Russian, so I can get the gist of some similar languages. I could tell he appeared to be speaking in some sort of Italian, describing a small female with brown hair and a jacket. He also kept saying sola, which really got my attention, as that means alone in many languages. I started to get a bit anxious at that point. My heart pounded harder every time he looked in my direction. Best case scenario, he was some slimy dude describing me to his friends, but life is too short to count on the best case scenario. I placed my bag in my lap and discreetly strapped the knife to my arm underneath the sleeve of my jacket, just in case. I texted my friend to see if he could meet me at the station itself, so I wouldn't have to walk there alone. The reception on the train was bad, though, and the text never went through. The train arrived at my stop. I tried to wait until the very last second to get off, so the man wouldn't follow me. The doors closed a second or two right behind me, but the skinny dude managed to slip right through them because of his abnormal skinniness. I started picking up the pace and tried to get lost in the crowd on the way to pay my fare. Once I had paid, I started booking it to my friend's place. I tried not to run too fast to make myself less visible. I turned around and saw that no one seemed to be behind me, but I couldn't relax until I'd arrived at my friend's apartment. There was a big burly guy who lived near my friend's building and would blast 80s jams and work out on his porch every evening. I prayed he would still be out there by the time I passed by his house, so I could chill there for a second and call my friend. I walked by, but unfortunately the man didn't seem to be working out tonight. I heard footsteps behind me, and turned around. Just as I'd feared, the purple shirt man was following me, and he was swiftly gaining on me. I started to run, and in my panic, I didn't realize there was a car stopped in the middle of the road a few feet ahead of me, with the side door wide open. The guy caught up to me, and lunged his hands around my waist. He was surprisingly strong for such a skinny guy. In one of what is probably the most crucial decisions of my life, I slipped the knife out from its sheath and stabbed wherever I could, flailing to get free. I heard fabric rip. The serrated knife had gotten caught on his shirt. I used the leverage of him gripping me to actually aim this time. I slammed the knife under his button-down and pushed it in as hard as I could. I had never been more aware of how fundamentally defenseless I am than that moment. I couldn't even scream or make a sound at all. It was like I had gone completely mute or was holding my breath or something. I have no idea how deeply I'd stabbed the man or how injured he was. Honestly, I didn't care. He dropped me in an instant, and I ran across the street, almost getting hit by a passing car. I sprinted up to my friend's apartment. I noticed an empty cop car sitting next to my friend's building, and this made me even more paranoid. At the time, and probably still, my gut instinct was the police would care more about me having a knife on me than almost getting kidnapped. My friend buzzed me into his building, and I went inside, going straight to his bathroom without even saying hello. I washed the blood off my knife and the scrapes I had gotten in the struggle. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for some reason, I decided not to tell my friend what just happened. I sat with him on his balcony and hung out and laughed as if nothing had ever happened. I can't tell if it was simply shock or just being so desensitized from the city. But to this day, I still occasionally have moments where I realize the gravity of what happened that day. Writing it out helps me wake up a bit. To the psycho in the purple button-down, I'm not really sorry I stabbed you. I hope it went in real deep. I think I was around 9 years old when this event happened. You'd think that such an impactful memory would ingrain itself completely into my brain, that I would remember exactly when it happened, and every single small little detail. But it was one of those really scary things that I honestly would have been happier to just forget altogether. My dad and I like to go camping all the time, you see. He began taking me when I was much younger, and I even had my own little pip tent. I loved it. It was small, but hey, so was I, so it worked out just fine in the end. My favorite thing about camping would be that in lieu of ghost stories, my dad would actually do this little puppet show for me. We would put up my tent to the side so the side wall of it would be facing the fire, and he would do this little shadow puppet thing with his hands. It was actually really fun, and he was super good at it too, surprisingly. The fact was that with a crackling fire behind him as he made these hand puppets, the images turned out to be really solid, and sometimes really, really creepy. Generally, by the time he was done telling his story, I would be so tuckered out I'd fall right to sleep. I won't go into too much detail about the camping trip itself when this happened. It was just me and my father. My mom didn't really like camping, so she never went with us. We go out into the woods, set up our tents, and made the area up for the fire. We then went and did some fishing. We actually had a nice haul that day, which my father then cooked for us over the fire. I always did love fish, and love it to this day. No one can cook a fish as good as my father did. When it came closer to time to go to bed, I was excited because that meant two things. My dad and I would make some s'mores together, and then I would go into my tent with the s'mores while my dad told me his story, using his scary hand puppets. Once I had my plate full of treats, I eagerly rushed into my tent. I got all nestled into my sleeping bag and ate those s'mores, while my dad told a few scary stories. It was pretty fun. I dozed off, though, before the ending of the last one. I woke up a little bit later, not even realizing how long I'd been asleep, or even what time it was currently. I assumed I'd only dozed off for a moment, though, and that my father must not have even realized this, because he still seemed to be doing his hand puppet show. I opened my eyes wide and sat up in my tent, watching him intently. He wasn't actually telling me a story anymore, though. He was making a hand puppet of a bunny rabbit, and kind of just making it aimlessly hop around on the wall of the tent. I kept waiting for him to say something funny, or something scary, like it was a vicious killer rabbit or something, but he didn't say a single word. Instead, he just kept making this bunny hop around in a circle, coming closer to my tent, then going further away, He kept this up for quite a long time, too. I was a bit confused now, so I decided to open my tent and see if something was wrong. The shadows had gotten quite close now, so I unzipped the flap and opened it up and looked over to my father, only to see it was not my father at all. It was a strange man I'd never seen before, with a sick grin on his face. He continued to make bunny motions with his hands as he stared right into my eyes. Then he stopped, and he rushed over to the tent and grabbed me. I, of course, screamed before the guy could get his hand over my mouth. My father woke up right away and came rushing out of the tent. When he saw the man struggling with me, he had the wherewithal to grab the fish skillet and smack the man upside the head with it twice before the guy fell over. I was now free, but my dad was not done yet. I can't tell you how many times he bashed this man over the head, who was now struggling to return to his feet. Eventually he managed to, and ran stumbling off into the night. My dad decided it was best to just leave, rather than wait until the morning. Fortunately, we hadn't parked too far away. We grabbed all of our stuff, rushed to the truck, and went home right away. That strange man ruined camping for me for years. Whenever we talked about going, I would see that man's horrifying face and remember him grabbing me, and I would have to decline. This story happened back in the 1970s. Thinking back on it, it's kind of weird, because there's no way anyone could get away with something like this nowadays. I was 10 years old at the time, and sitting in class. It was about 10:30 in the morning, I believe. We had been back from lunch for a while. The school secretary suddenly rushed in and handed the teacher a note. After reading the note, the teacher handed it back. Then she said, "Josh, would you please go with Miss Harris?" All of the kids in class went, "Ooh," like kids do when they assume that another child just got in trouble. My teacher tried to quiet them down as I walked out and followed her into the hallway. She told me she'd just received a phone call from my father that my brother had been in a terrible accident. They couldn't come to pick me up, but they wanted me to come straight home right now. Now, I walked to and from school. Everyone in my town did, really. Only the kids who lived in the outskirts of town actually got to ride the bus. I grabbed my backpack and headed out right away. Of course, I was worried about my younger brother and figured I should get back as quickly as possible. I had been walking for only a few minutes when I started to hear footsteps right behind me. I turned around to check and saw a rather tall man was now following me from a bit far a ways back. He was wearing a dark coat and covered his face, but it was cold enough outside that I didn't think very much about it in the moment. We weren't the only two people out walking, as it was right in the middle of both a school and work day. My walk home was a large trek. I had to go down several different streets and through a park as well. When I turned down the first street, I was walking for a while before I heard the footsteps behind me again. I peeked around my shoulder and noticed the man had turned the corner as well and was still following me. It was at this point I began to get a little bit nervous, but I was still not totally worried. The moment I did begin to get very worried was when I turned the following corners and still heard the man walking behind me. We had watched film strips at school about strangers, and all the frightening images those had put in my mind suddenly came rushing back. I began to think that this man was a legitimate kidnapper or something. As I got closer to the park, I decided to cut under a break in the chain-link fence that some of us kids like to sneak through. A bigger guy wouldn't be able to get through that space, and I figured I'd be able to lose him really quickly. With a quick peek over my shoulder, I noticed the man was now not far behind me, so I had to hurry. When I came upon the fence, I saw the little trench under it. I knew I would fit right away, so I hurried up and slipped onto my belly and began to slide under. The problem with my plan was that all the previous times I'd tried to go under the fence, I hadn't had my backpack on my back, and I'd forgotten this. I didn't fit. My backpack got snagged on the fence. I hadn't been listening to the footsteps any longer, but it didn't matter anymore. because the man was right on me. He grabbed my foot and tried to pull me back from under the fence. I tried to kick him with my other foot, but I was just a small kid. It didn't do much good. While I was struggling in his grip, I kept trying to pull my arms out of the straps of my backpack. It was snagged, and I was not going to get it undone. I kept trying to kick the man, and although it did take a while, I was able to get the straps to slide off of me. The problem was this asshole still had my leg. I focused on repeatedly kicking his hand with my other leg, and he slightly lost his grip. He grabbed onto my shoe. That turned out to be a bit of luck that I needed, though, as I was able to slip my foot right out of it. The man stumbled backward, and I had enough time to slip the rest of the way through the fence. I then got up and ran as fast as I could, with only one shoe through that park. Fortunately, there was a mother with 2 kids at the playground. I ran up to them crying and scared. The woman was very sweet and took me home to my parents. When I got home, my mom was home, but my dad wasn't. She was worried and thanked the woman who helped me, who also explained everything that happened. I swear, you've never seen a mother so grateful. But what shocked me the most was when I saw my little brother right there, sitting in front of the television and watching a game show. He wasn't hurt at all. My dad wasn't home waiting for me. My mom called the police, who found my backpack. It had been thoroughly emptied, and my belongings were scattered all over the place. My parents had never called the school. All we could figure out was that the man who attacked me had to have set the entire thing up. I never found out who he was either, but I always figured it had to be someone my parents knew. How else would he have been able to know when I was at school, and even who I was, that I had a brother as well? In the beginning of this story, I mentioned that this sort of thing couldn't happen nowadays. Well, I only guessed that really. I don't know that for a fact, but I sure as hell hope it can't, because that shit is pretty damn scary. This happened when I was around 13 or so. I was quite a tomboy back in the day, and had a huge collection of Nerf guns. Although I did have some girlfriends, my friends were mainly guys who had collections which rivaled my own. My group consisted of around 5 people. One day, my friends and I, being the kids we were, decided to organize a Nerf war held at our local park. It wasn't the typical big open green space though. It was more of a forest, as we were in Australia. Because of this, the park was filled with big gum trees to hide behind and had a long creek running down the middle. The perfect conditions for a Nerf war. We set the date, and one of my friends said he would bring a bunch of his friends over as well, so we'd have much bigger teams and a bigger event. This meant we'd have about 4 people on each side. We agreed, and they came as well. By the time the chosen Sunday rolled around, we were all ready and kitted up for the fight. I, like everyone else, had brought most of my Nerf guns along, which I then shared amongst my team. Some of us even brought walkie-talkies and other special gadgets. To onlookers, we probably looked quite silly, but we really didn't care. The excitement of being with all my friends forced back my usual shy nature. Anyway, after everyone arrived, we started working on our bases. Then we began the war. All was going well until about an hour in. I sat alone at our team's makeshift base. My main weapon had jammed, and I was trying to fix it by poking sticks into the barrel and repeatedly pressing the trigger, all to no avail, of course. The others on my team were off scouting through the woods. All I could hear were Nerf blasters going off, until an unsettling whistling noise suddenly came from behind me. I could hear footsteps on the dried leaves, getting closer and closer. At first, I assumed it was one of my teammates playing a joke on me, so I kept working on my gun with my back to the trees. But then, I saw him. His face still haunts me to this day. There was a tall old man, probably in his 60s or so, walking right by me. He had unwashed clothes, and he was swinging a gray plastic bag, which looked as though it was filled with dried blood. I couldn't really tell what it was. He noticed me and stopped walking, standing about 15 feet away. His eyes widened as he looked over at me, and he continued to whistle some tune I didn't recognize. I remember feeling terrified. I was alone, with nothing but a jammed Nerf gun for protection. I thought if I kept ignoring him, he might go away, but of course he didn't. He stopped in place and kept staring at me. My thoughts turned to making a plan of action. He didn't look like he'd be able to outrun me, but I still felt too terrified to move. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed for my mom, still not meeting his uncomfortable gaze. I held the phone up to my ear and tried to appear as though I didn't even notice him. "Ryan." I flinched as I didn't hear my mom's voice. I heard his calling out to me. He stopped the whistling and began to speak to me in a raspy voice. "Come and play with me, little girl." He started to swing the bag once more. Our eyes met, just as my mom picked up the phone. I whispered to her there was a strange man trying to talk to me. I could feel myself tearing up. Even now, I can't forget the way he was staring at me, like an animal who decided he was going to eat me. My mom was furiously telling me to calm down, and she couldn't understand what I was saying. The man finally stopped staring when my younger team member called out to me, saying their gun was broken. It happened to be my younger sister, who my mom had forced me to bring along. The man turned away from me and started towards her instead. I was begging my mom to come and find us, and that the man was now after my sister, who was only 9 at the time. She told me to gather up my sister and everyone else who was with us. I was so scared, but I managed to find the courage to run into the woods and call to everyone else for help. Thankfully, the man hadn't caught my sister yet. The others all came running. Only one of them seemed to have seen him walking through the woods prior. They said he was walking quite quickly, almost running. They thought it was odd, but thought nothing of it at the time. Once we all gathered together, I guess the man was intimidated by our numbers and took off running back into the forest. The worst and most terrifying thing that ever happened to me happened because of my former stepdad. Even now, years later, I get so pissed off just thinking about it. If I could, I would beat the shit out of him. After my father passed away, my mother fell into a horrible and understandable depression. She began dating this guy who, while my father was still alive, she wouldn't have even considered giving the time of day to. Jack was a big guy and a complete lowlife as well. I really don't want to go into too much description of him because it infuriates me to even try. I can't stand this guy. My mother's relationship with Jack was completely toxic. They would go to these biker bars and go out and drink all night. I'd never seen my mom drunk a day in my 15 years of life before, but once she met Jack, she got drunk all the time. After less than a month of dating, my mom let him move in. She didn't even ask my opinion. Now, I know what most of you are probably thinking. She didn't need my permission, and I realized that it's not permission I was worried about. I feel like she should have asked my opinion on the matter, and made up her own mind after that. Jack didn't work, of course. My mom did, and he would stay home all day on his lazy ass, watching TV and drinking beer. He knew I didn't like him, but he lorded this fact over me. Whenever I looked like I was angry with him or that I wasn't going to follow his orders, he'd say words I would never forget. "You damn well do it, or I'm gonna cut your balls off." He said that to me all the time. I never took it seriously. I mean, the guy was a jackass and a loser, but he wasn't stupid enough to actually do anything physical to me. I mean, if he even tried, he'd be sitting in a damn prison cell. It would always be something like, "Get me a fucking beer or I'll cut your balls off," or over something stupid and minor. I wasn't really happy with this. He even said it in front of my mom, and she just laughed. She married him too, and it was quick. He had been living there for only 3 months when she married him, and like most of these stories, that was the moment when things began to get even worse. The nights of going out and drinking at the bar still happened, but rather than coming home and having a fun time, they'd always be fighting. I tried to spend as much time as I could in my bedroom, not listening to their bullshit. He threatened to smack her all the time. but he never did. He would then guilt my mom into forgiving him, and the whole thing would start all over again the next night. The thing that makes me angry, that makes me fume with unadulterated anger, happened on my 16th birthday. Of course, neither of them did anything to celebrate for me. My mom and Jack went out drinking. I went to my bedroom to read, because it was the only thing I really could do. I was reading late into the night. It had to be around 1:30 in the morning or so, when I heard Jack's bike pull up in the driveway. I heard them arguing and rolled my eyes and groaned, wishing I could at least not have to deal with this on my birthday. They rushed into the house, yelling and screaming. I don't even know what they were arguing about. The one thing that was different this time, though, was I heard my mom scream at Jack. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a savage hit, and the loudest crashing I'd ever heard in my life. I jumped out of my bed, scared and knowing what had just happened. When I got into the living room, my fears were confirmed. My mom was laying bleeding and unconscious on the floor over a broken coffee table. Anger flooded my body. I ran up and tried to tackle that piece of shit that hit my mother. Although I slammed into him pretty hard, it didn't have much effect on him. He easily smacked me and knocked me hard to the floor. I was seeing stars when he grabbed me by my shirt and dragged me into the kitchen. I didn't know what he was doing, but he grabbed something off the counter, picked me up, and slammed me hard against the kitchen wall, completely knocking the wind out of me. It was then I saw him holding a knife in his hand. I winced, expecting Jack to kill me right then. Instead, to my shock, he reached down, undid my belt, and opened up my jeans, pushing them and my boxers to the floor. I was confused at first, but then the words he'd always threatened me with came rushing back to my head. Jack really was going to cut my balls off. He moved the knife down, while holding me against the wall by my neck with one arm. I was thrashing and struggling, doing everything I could to get this fucker off me, but I couldn't force him off no matter what I did. I felt tears going down my eyes, completely convinced I was about to be castrated. I felt him begin to cut. If you've never been cut in a sensitive place before, you might not understand what happened next. It was a blinding pain. Everything went white. Flailing in agony, I kicked out over and over. I kicked him in the balls, the knees, the stomach. I even kicked his hand, knocking the knife away. My adrenaline was really rushing. It was the shock of what was going on that had him struggling the most. Then a shot rang out. He let go of me and screamed. I guess a beautiful story would have been that he fell over, and I saw my mother standing there holding the gun behind him. But no, there was a gun, being held by our kindly next-door neighbor, Janice, a 67-year-old widow who never put up with anyone's bullshit. She'd heard everything going on, grabbed her rifle, and rushed over. If you've never seen an old grandma pissed off and holding a rifle, you've never lived before. Jack went to prison, and my mom, of course, divorced him. I was happy she wasn't seriously injured. Jack had actually seriously cut my privates, which led me to believe my balls weren't his only target that night. Fortunately, it wasn't too bad that it wasn't able to be fixed, but it hurt worse than anything I've ever experienced before or since. I got a pretty gnarly scar. At least it makes an interesting story, but my blood boils just telling it. Generally, I try to tell people it was just a childhood injury and not talk about it after. I've never seen Jack again, and my mom never got married again either. Just the other night, my aunt and I were drinking some beers around the fire pit in my backyard when she told me a story I'd never heard her mention before. I'm not a very good writer, but the way she told it had me glued to my seat. Because of that, I asked her to write it down for me so I could share it with everyone else. She was a little bit nervous about the idea at first, but as soon as I convinced her she could write it in a way to remain anonymous, she agreed with me. I do warn everyone listening to this that the subject matter is very upsetting and may trigger those who have been victims of violence in the past. Remember, you were warned. It was sometime in the middle 1980s, and I was living in the Midwest with a friend from back home. We had been bouncing from temp job to temp job for the past 5 years or so. Late one night, we decided to stop at a liquor store to pick up some booze. Neither of us had jobs at the time, and she happened to notice a help wanted sign in the front window. The following day, she returned and asked about the job. By the end of the day, she had been hired. She'd always had a way about her, a way to put people at ease. It was the greatest character trait she had. I honestly don't believe she ever had an enemy a day in her life. Anyhow, while I continued my search for permanent employment, she was enjoying her job and making a lot of new friends to boot. She would often invite her coworkers over to our apartment after work to party together. We always had a really awesome time. They were all really good people. I even dated one of the guys she worked with. But it didn't work out due to extraneous circumstances. Then, just as life was starting to get good for us all, a terrible crime occurred, and I would lose my best friend forever. The night the murders happened, my roommate was doing her closing duties. Most of the staff had met up at the store to head over to our place together. Sometime just before she locked the doors, two guys came in and walked around the store. She waited for several minutes at the register before reminding them the store was closing. This was when the men pulled out their guns. One herded the staff together into the walk-in cooler, while the other locked the door and switched off the sign. Once they were back together, the leader, the guy who led everyone into the cooler, assured them no one would be harmed as long as someone opened the safe for them. They'd simply take the money and leave. No one spoke until the doorman whipped one of the girls across the head with his pistol. My roommate quickly told them that the only person who had the key to the safe was the day manager, and he wasn't there. This wasn't true, of course. He was at the back of the group comforting his girlfriend that had just been hit. Still, no one to this day understands why she lied. She often said that if she was robbed, she wasn't about to die for somebody else's money. The two robbers were beginning to get irritated, so my roommate mentioned that the money was still in the register. It was only around $30, but at least it was something. The two men ignored her, but the door guy walked out of the cooler and came back a few minutes later. They walked away a couple of steps and talked together in private. About what, no one can say. When they returned to the group, the leader was visibly angrier. He repeated what he'd said earlier, but this time no one said anything back. That's where it all went to crap. The leader's frustration boiled over. He took one step toward the group and kicked the young man in front of him. Then he opened fire on the entire group. For a solid minute, he and his accomplice emptied their guns into the victims. The only survivor, who just happened to be the day manager, said he'd been shot at least 4 times before they moved on to the next person. Even though he had tried to cover his girlfriend with his body, she was still hit multiple times herself. He lost consciousness soon after the shots stopped, so no one knows exactly when the shooters left. What is known for sure is that 5 innocent people lost their lives for $32.53. It was almost 9 hours before they were found. By then, anyone who could have been saved except the one had already died. His stay in the hospital lasted 2 weeks, and the month after that was spent in physical therapy, learning how to use his arms again. The last time I spoke with him was sometime in 1997. He was still seeing a psychologist twice a month. As far as I understand it, only one of the shooters was ever arrested, the door guy, and that was for a different crime. He was connected to the murders while serving time in prison. He eventually did cop to it, but would never give up who his partner was. He would only say they had been killed while committing another robbery. Nobody still involved in the case believed him, but until they find a clue connecting them to a name, the case is at a standstill. If you asked me who was the most affected by the killings, I would probably say it was that day manager, Ben. Not only had my roommate lied to protect him, his attempt to save the girl he loved failed, and he spent all night lying next to her, while she and 4 of his other friends slowly bled to death. I'd say in comparison, I got off easy. Don't get me wrong, many of those people were my friends too. One of them the best friend I've ever had, and not a week goes by that I don't think about them all. But when it comes to Ben, I can't help but think his life will never be the same again. Until last week, I worked a dead-end job at a gas station across town. This story is why I quit, and the crazy week that led up to it. About 2 weeks ago, my old man came into my room, woke me up, and started bitching about how lazy I was and how I needed to get a job. I didn't really have anything to say to this, honestly. Of course, he got even more mad because of that, though. He informed me that he had asked his friend to give me a job at his gas station. I would have appreciated if he would have asked me first, but of course he did not. My first shift also started in a few hours. Wow, what an asshole. So, after a super quick shower, I shot off to begin my first surprise day of work. I could tell the job was going to suck immediately. My dad's friend was a douche, and most of the other employees were too. One girl even thought she was Nicki Minaj or something. The whole time she was working, she was rapping or singing random R&B songs. For some reason, the king douche put her with me for every single shift, and I had to listen to this crap all the time. On the rare occasion she wasn't singing or rapping constantly, she would only talk about her baby daddy. As you can imagine, most of the time I was working, I wanted to eat a box full of Tide Pods and chase it with a jug of bleach. If you thought it couldn't get any worse though, you're wrong. When the owner wasn't around, her friends hung out at the store and did so for hours. I don't mean just 2 or 3 people either. I mean upwards of 20 or more. They would all park their cars right in front of the store where customers should have been able to park and play their stereos at astronomical levels. The bass was so bad it would even shake the windows sometimes. It was my perfect idea of a living hell. At some point, it even got to the point where I was having nightmares I was trapped in a gangsta rap video. And just like a gangsta rap video, a gunfight broke out at the store while we were working just 2 nights ago. One of my co-workers' friends had a beef with a gang member in another neighborhood, I guess. This beef had of course started as something relatively tame, but quickly escalated to extreme violence. My co-worker's friend got into a fight with the gang member's cousin, and must have messed him up pretty bad, because the gang member's cousin ended up in the hospital for several days. Because of this, they swore revenge, and that he was going to fill that guy with holes. A normal person would have laid low for a while if someone told him a gangster was now gunning for him, but none of my co-worker's friends could be called anything near normal. So, of course, they continued acting as if nothing was wrong, until the gang member spotted him loafing around and drinking booze in our parking lot. The shooting part of the nightmare didn't last long, but by the time it was through, 2 of my co-workers' friends were immediately dead, and 3 other innocent bystanders were injured as well. The guy who was the intended target of the attack got away completely unscathed. 2 of her female friends were amongst the people killed. I even saw one of the girls begging the paramedics not to let her die as they rushed her away. The 3 bystanders injured had absolutely nothing to do with the foolishness at all. Lucky for them, they got off with minor injuries. The worst of the 3 just happening to be myself. I received a graze to my knee and a direct hit to my shin as well. Holy hell, did that fucking hurt. My first call upon waking up today was to the store manager to let him know I was quitting immediately. He sounded like he had been expecting it, honestly. As far as I know, cut-rate Nicki Minaj was still working there, despite the fact her presence caused this entire thing to begin with. The shooting wasn't the whole reason I quit. The king douche not offering to pay my medical bills at all was the biggest reason. My dad didn't even say anything about this, even though the guy was supposed to be his friend. I haven't told him yet, but I'm sure his friend will call him sometime today and tell him. I don't give a flip if he gets mad at me for quitting or not. That job could never pay enough to make it worth getting shot, let alone twice. I'd rather work in the sewers than put up with all that crap I've had to deal with for the past 2 weeks. If that job means so much to him, he can go work there himself with his tightwad buddy and dollar store Nicki Minaj while they all wait to get shot. I've had enough of that. No more for me. Each year on the birthday of my brother, My father and I try to find a new way to ensure he's remembered. With Dad being out of the country this year, I had to celebrate his memory on my own. So I decided to write down my brother's life story and share it with others. Brian was always a little bit different than the other kids we grew up with. These days, I imagine a teacher would have labeled him as having autism and drugged the uniqueness out of him. I want to make it clear from the start that he was not mentally disabled. It was the exact opposite, in fact. He was so smart that he acquired the nickname The Brain in middle school. His intelligence made him very popular and a very good student as well. He even got to graduate a whole year early because he was so smart. College was more of the same until his junior year, when he began to have some problems. He started skipping classes and disappearing for days at a time. When we discovered he was hearing voices, my dad flew into town and took him to a doctor. It took a few, but eventually the diagnosis of schizophrenia was made, and he was put on medication. Even with the medication, though, it was obvious he was no longer going to make it in school. He moved back home soon after because of this. His first year was a series of ups and downs, while the doctors tried to find a medication that would work long term. He'd start a drug, do well for a few weeks, and then go back to disappearing. We found out that on one of his vacations, that he'd been getting high on street drugs to suppress his symptoms. To our relief, though, just after the new year, they finally found a medicine that worked. Things pretty drastically improved after that. A program was started that was partnered with the county to help those with mental illnesses find employment. Brian signed up for it right away, and a month later he got a job at a convenience store just down the street. This proved to be a blessing and a curse as well. Now that he was doing well and working, his life was getting back on track after 2 long years of hell. He really loved that job and was happy to be back providing for himself. We were all finally able to move forward and live a semblance of a normal life. That's the way it stayed for the next 2.5 years. Then the store closed. Losing that job he loved so much sent Brian back into his old habits of sleeping on the streets and abusing drugs. When he was off his meds, he was a completely different man, one I could not recognize at all. He would be gone a few days, come back and restart his medicine and start doing well, but then for no reason at all stop altogether and disappear again for another week. Then, one day, just like that, he never came back. He had been missing for over a week at that point, when we started to really worry. He'd always come home before, so we gave him 3 more days before we started looking for him. We spent several more driving around town, going to all his usual haunts, but no one had seen him for over a week. At this point, we began to panic, so we did what we should have done in the first place. We went to the police. Though, since he was an adult with a history of psychological troubles, and we had no proof he'd been taken against his will, all we could do was file a simple report. The cops said they would keep an eye out for him, but that was the best they could do at this point. The only option we had left was to go home and hope Brian would show up once again. Longer and longer time went by, though, and the more worried I became. Dad didn't indicate anything about the understandable level of concern. At least, he didn't show it. Mom was the worst, though. She said more than once she had a really bad feeling, and she couldn't handle it well at all. Every day he stayed gone made me more anxious. Regardless of how I felt inside, though, I kept my feelings to myself and maintained a mask of optimism. After a year of no word, I determined that ever hearing from him again was completely up to him. I had no control over his life, and letting the possibilities eat me up from the inside was getting me nowhere. When he did come back, we would all welcome him with open arms. We did the best we could to get on with living. Dad and I managed to pull it off relatively well, but Mom didn't. The doctors eventually discovered a cancer in her breast after Brian had been gone about 5 years. I believe the stress of worrying about him 24 hours a day fed into this, and perhaps even caused it in the first place. Combined with her total disregard for treatment, no matter how much we begged, she was gone in less than 6 months. Now, it was just my dad and I. We were forced to pick up the pieces and move on again, or let it kill us too. Life carried on and nothing really changed. That was until 2 years later, when we finally received the call we'd been waiting for. But the news was not what we had expected. Earlier in the month, a family had purchased that old convenience store. They had hired a cleaning company to go into the place and clean up the mess left after almost 8 years of sitting closed. One morning, the crew was in the storage room, picking up the leftovers of a ceiling collapse, when they made a terrible discovery. The body of what was believed to be a man was buried under the pile of ceiling tiles and insulation. The police had no idea who it could be. There were no marks on the body visible to indicate the cause of death. Ultimately, at the end of a 3-week investigation, including autopsy and DNA tests, it was determined that body in the back room was Brian. They never arrived at a concrete answer of how he died, but drug paraphernalia was found near him. The strongest theory was overdose, but they didn't find any marks on him or anything like that. Whether on purpose or not, it'll never be known. So, there we were. Over 7 years after we lost him, Dad and I were burying him next to Mom in the family plot. That day was a hard one, but knowing where Brian was after all this time took away a bit of the sting. We only wish Mom had survived to see it. It turned out she had been right all along. Brian had been dead the entire time, just a few blocks down the road, in the one place he had left that gave him joy and helped him to feel normal again. Knowing that made me smile in a strange way. I look forward to this day every year, an opportunity to remember him and his far too short life. It's one of the few things left that makes me smile. Hopefully, Dad will be back from his work next year, and we can celebrate together again. It may be my last chance to do so. The disease that took my mom apparently picked me to be its next victim. If Dad's still working and I've moved on next year, do me a favor and share this story again. Brian was a beautiful man, and despite his troubles, he was loved by all those he met, and at the least he should always be remembered for that. Five or so years ago, before I met my husband Brian, I lived in a dinky little apartment complex just off of campus. My roommate then was another girl attending the university. Neither of us owned a car, so we had no choice but to walk the 3 blocks to a convenience store located across the street from the science building. Not a single day went by when we didn't need to pick up something and became well known by the people working there. One year, my roommate had a friend from back home, Nina, spending the week of spring break with us. She seemed cool enough, but she sometimes came across as abrasive to people she didn't know. Kinda had a big mouth, I guess. This trait made me laugh at times, but her severe rudeness could put us in a spot of trouble as well. On the Saturday night before she was scheduled to leave, we had a little get-together at our place. My roommate was with her boyfriend, so Nina and I were the only ones around at the time. Earlier that day, she had scored an ounce of bud from one of our neighbors. He would sell us a little bit from time to time. We were planning on smoking before everyone started showing up, but I realized we were all out of papers. Since we were going to have to pick up some beer anyway, we decided to head down to the store. We loaded up on plenty of drinks and snacks when we got there, and then headed back to the apartment. As we walked across the parking lot, though, we noticed some guys hanging out on the side of the building. They did yell some crude words at us, but that wasn't anything out of the norm. On occasion, when I went out to the store at night, there were always a couple of dudes hanging around. Sometimes they would make an off-color comment, but I would always just laugh it off. They weren't being mean or anything. I just thought they were having a bit of fun. Nothing was said after that. I'd walk on home and get no further problems from them. That night, though, I was with Nina, and she was not familiar with this little game being played. So, when the guys made their usual comments, she snapped off on them. "Fuck off, you bastards! Go to hell!" That reply did not go down well with them. They acted in a way I'd never seen before. They started calling us whores and stupid sluts. It may have ended there, but when Nina heard their reaction, she gave them the finger. It quickly escalated after that. 2 of the guys began to sprint after us, cursing the whole way. Understandably, I was terrified and started running away from them. Nina laughed as if we were playing a game or something, but looking back at them, I certainly didn't think they looked like they were playing around. They looked furious. I doubt any girl had ever spoken to them like that before, and it surely made them angry. Nina finally got the hint and began to run with me. Luckily, we weren't far from the apartment. We got to the door and inside before they could catch us. I locked the deadbolt behind us and took a big breath. Nina started to laugh again. She hadn't taken them seriously at all and must have seen it as some big joke. I didn't though, that's for sure. Her laughing made me even angrier. I commenced on cussing her out, but she just continued to laugh. It seemed she had no ability to take anything seriously. And she wasn't even high yet. I'd had enough of her and headed into the kitchen to put up the beer and chips. On my way out of the kitchen and into my room, a loud pounding on the door started. I freaked out and hid under the window next to it. Nina stood frozen in front of the door, and her eyes grew as wide as saucers. I think she finally started to get it. The pounding continued, followed by loud cussing and calling us filthy names I don't dare to repeat here. Carefully, I stood up and peeked out a little crack in the blinds. There were 3 guys now, and they were pissed. Then things got far worse. My male neighbor, the one who sold us weed, came walking down the stairs yelling at the guys and asking them what their problem was. I began to feel a bit of relief. He was a big dude and I'd never seen anyone give him any trouble. However, before he could get anywhere by talking to them, all 3 guys jumped on him and started beating him. He went down quickly, but they continued to beat him by kicking him one after the other. All of a sudden, they heard Nina yelling through the door at them. She demanded they stop or she was calling the cops. They must have heard her because they turned back toward the door and started cussing at her again, laughing at the threat. I looked around the corner and saw Nina with her eyes stuck to the peephole, dialing 911 on her phone. She connected with the dispatcher and explained the situation as fast as she could. She sat quiet for a moment, listening, and then yelled back through the door. "The cops are on their way. You guys better get the fuck out of here." They continued to laugh, but soon stopped and began talking amongst each other. One more curse was uttered, and one of them spat on the door. Then they looked at each other and ran off. I let out a giant sigh. I could finally breathe again. I wanted to go out and check on my neighbor, but was still way too terrified to go outside. He was laying motionless as I looked out at him. I started praying and asking for him not to be dead. About a minute later, I saw some beams from flashlights, followed by 4 cops walking carefully toward the door. One crouched down and checked my neighbor's pulse. I could hear the words "faint pulse" as he spoke through his radio. When the officers knocked on the door, Nina opened it for them. She gave the one in front a big hug and kiss on the cheek. He stood there frozen in surprise. She let go and they all entered the apartment. We thanked them for showing up so fast, and Nina began blurting the entire story before they even had time to ask. I hurried out behind them to check on my neighbor. A paramedic came up right after and started working on him. I asked them if my neighbor was going to be okay. He simply looked at me and said he should make it, but he'll have to fight. It wasn't the news I wanted to hear, but I was happy to hear he was likely to survive. When his partner arrived soon after, they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him away. Even though I wanted to go with them, I knew I had to stay behind and talk to the police. I went and sat back down and waited to be questioned. The cops left a few hours later. I was still shaking a little from the shock of everything. I felt bad for what happened to my neighbor. He didn't deserve that. He was just trying to help us. If I would have had a car, I would have went to the hospital to check on him, but unfortunately I didn't. I couldn't think of anything better than a beer and some smoke to help me relax. I was overjoyed that no one decided to show up for our party that night. Things could have turned out far worse. While we sat in front of the TV and smoked, Ina apologized for almost getting us killed. I was happy to hear it, but I wasn't the person she really needed to apologize to. She agreed and stayed a day longer to go with me on the bus to see him, in the hospital, and to apologize in person. Like any real hero, he said there was no need, and asked how we were instead. We spent most of the day with him, until they eventually kicked us out. Nina left the next morning, and happily I've never seen her again. My neighbor Alex spent the whole next week in the hospital recuperating from the attack. When he returned to the complex, my roommate and I had him over for dinner. She figured it was the least we could do to thank him for helping, and of course I agreed. For the remainder of the time I lived there, I would see him from time to time, never forgetting to thank him for what he did. He managed to bounce back from his injuries as well. Unfortunately, although his limp eventually went away and the cuts healed, he'll most likely have slight memory issues for the rest of his life. I can only hope he's able to move on and forget myself, Nina, and the whole mess that was caused because of all of it. My wife and I have a really unique setup in our house. My wife is a strict vegetarian, you see, but I wouldn't give up meat to save my life. She also really doesn't drink, and I'd like to have some beer every day personally. When I get home from work, she's so strict about this that she actually worries about our food and stuff getting mixed together. It's sort of obsessive-compulsive, I guess. So, in order to not have her worrying about it, I let her use the kitchen refrigerator for her food, and bought a second, smaller refrigerator for my food and beer. I kept this one out in the garage. I know, it must seem sort of weird for a husband and wife to have their food completely separate from one another, but I never really thought about it that much. We didn't often have meals together. Rather, we just eat whenever we felt like it, really. For my wife, at least, it was much less of a social thing than it was simply a necessity. Plus, I like to eat much later into the night, and she wouldn't touch a single thing after 7 p.m. For most nights, I got used to going over to the garage door and didn't even bother turning the light on. I had to use the hallway light to see my way over to the refrigerator, open it up, quickly grab what I wanted, and then rush back into the house. I would do this over and over. I didn't actually use the 2-car garage for much of anything else. My wife and I parked our cars in the driveway mostly. I did have 2 old motorcycles that I didn't really use anymore and a broken down Ford Mustang, along with some old boxes stored in there though. One night, my wife had already had her food and she decided to go to bed pretty early. It was about 10 o'clock when I realized I really hadn't had anything to eat. Again, this was not too out of the ordinary. Since my wife and I didn't really eat together, I'd often forget to eat until it was really late at night. I'd been watching some scary movies on Netflix since my wife was in bed. She didn't like that type of stuff. I got up and went over to the garage door, opened it, and went to grab some food. I can't quite explain it well, but for some reason, all of a sudden I felt very uneasy as I entered the garage. I had never felt that way before, but it was a very overwhelming, scared feeling. I chalked it up to the fact that maybe the movie I was watching was scarier than I'd initially thought it was. I quickly grabbed what I wanted, slammed the door shut, and made my way back into the home. I fixed myself the food, climbed into my chair, and started to watch my movie again. When it was over, I wasn't really that tired yet though. I was enjoying myself as well, so I decided to go ahead and pop another one in. First though, I needed to grab myself a couple of beers with which to enhance my enjoyment of this upcoming film. On my way over to the garage though, I began to remember my apprehension from before. It was odd because I watch these sorts of things all the time. I usually watch them alone as well. It had been years since I'd actually gotten freaked out by one. I tried to be bold and just go about my business as usual. When I got to the garage door, I tried to psych myself up. I told myself I was not going to chicken out. I opened the door, left it open, and cautiously made my way over to the refrigerator. While I was holding the door open though, I began to get extremely freaked out again. I couldn't quite explain why. I felt so timid at the time. I was hyper aware of what was going on around me. I got worked up, thinking someone must be in the garage with me. Surely it was just the movie making me scared though. It was worse when the garage door to the house slowly shut behind me. Rather than grab my beer, I jogged over to the door and quickly flipped on the garage light. The garage lights were extremely bright, and since I never used them, they immediately hurt my eyes in the darkness. I groaned, and simultaneously, I heard another groan. I rubbed my eyes quickly and looked over at the far side of the garage. I couldn't see anything, and at first I thought it must be my imagination. I walked over and looked around. I looked behind the boxes, behind the car. I didn't see anyone. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination, but once I turned around, I happened to glance into the back seat of the Mustang. I jumped in place when I saw someone lying in the back seat of the car, crouched down and trying to avoid being seen. This time I sprinted over to the door. I rushed into the house, slammed it behind me, and locked the door shut. The garage door opener was inside the home, so whoever was in there could not get out now. I called the police. They came and got the guy out. They found a box cutter and a razor blade on him, but that's not the scariest part. The part that got me the worst was that the man had apparently broken into my garage 2 months beforehand. He had been living in there the entire time, surviving off food from my refrigerator. Every single night I had walked into the garage without turning the light on, the man had been in there with me. That has been hard to get over. There's nothing worse than taking a wrong turn. Well, let me rephrase that quickly. There's nothing worse than taking a turn deliberately, only to realize much later on that it was the wrong turn. I was driving home from work one night. I always get bored to death going the same way over and over again, so occasionally, just to keep my mind focused, I try to take a new road and find my way home. I live in a pretty rural area too, so sometimes this can get me pretty lost. This time was definitely one of those. For people who haven't ever really lived out in the country, you might not know how positively frightening it can be to drive down an old dirt road through the hills with no streetlights, surrounded on all sides by trees in the dark. You can't drive particularly fast either, because there are plenty of sharp turns. The road I turned down that night in question had another problem as well. After a very short time on it, it quickly narrowed down to only a single lane. This made the ride even more difficult because it gave me only 2 options: drive in reverse and get back to the road I'd been driving on, or drive forward and eventually turn around in whatever driveway this road led to. I wish I could explain this in a way that truly conveyed how frightening it was. It was pitch black. My headlights only lit up a small portion of the area in front of me. Everything only slightly up ahead was completely dark, and everything behind me and to the side was pitch black. I had to drive extremely slowly, for fear of running into something dangerous. After much driving, the road took a sudden turn, and my worst fear became true. This did not lead to a driveway. Instead, it turned right into a big solid metal barrier gate. Like I said, there wasn't a driveway behind it either. I could see there was room beyond the gate to turn my car around a bit, so completely scared out of my wits, I pulled up close to the gate. I got out and of course left my door open and walked slowly over to it. I quickly grabbed it and swung it open, then I rushed back to my car and slammed the door. It gave me just enough space to drive through. I slowly drove in, turned around, and pulled past the gate. At that point, I should have just driven off and left the barrier gate open, but I'm the sort of person who just can't do that. I mean, I'd opened the gate in the first place. I felt obligated to close it as I left. I looked behind my car just to make sure, and I could barely see anything behind me. The taillights created a small amount of light, but it was not nearly enough to be able to see what I was doing. I didn't have a flashlight either. I should have left, but instead I opened the door of my car. I thought by leaving the door open, I might get more light, yet it didn't really help. Slowly, I began to walk back to the gate. I was practically blind. I kept my hand on my car as I moved back, hoping my eyes would adjust eventually. They did adjust enough for me to see the gate, so I reached out and put my hand on it, prepared to pull it closed. No sooner than I had touched the gate, though, I heard very clearly as if someone was right behind me speaking directly into my ear. "Get the hell out of here! Now!" I didn't bother with the gate. Hell, my fight or flight kicked in for the first time in my life. I ran to the car without even having any control over my body. I jumped in, slammed and locked the door, and hit the gas. As I started driving, I was much more scared than I had even been outside the car. My mind began playing tricks on me, and I began to wonder if someone was hiding in my back seat or something. I was too scared to look, though. I kept expecting someone to jump out in front of my car at any second, but I never stopped. I kept on driving until I got back to the main road. I turned down it and took the more safe way home. Of course, by the time I arrived, I looked in the back seat. No one was waiting there, thankfully. My uncle has always told me to keep out of the hills. He said there were some really unpleasant, unsavory, and very dangerous people out there. I used to think he was full of it, but I don't think that much anymore. I definitely want this story to be anonymous, as it's easily the scariest thing and the worst thing that's ever happened to me. This happened nearly 30 years ago, and even today I've not fully come to terms with it. Right now, I'm 38 years old, but when this happened, I was about 9 or so. My mom, my older brother, and myself were out on a Saturday outing. We were going to Kmart to do some shopping for school. My brother was about 15 at the time. My mom had put some items on layaway and needed to make a payment on them. When we got there, there was a really long line at the layaway. She wasn't going to be able to come back later, as the payment was due on that same day. While we were waiting, my brother was of course getting quite antsy, as was I. He asked my mom if he could take me to go look at the toys instead. She agreed and we went off together. My brother, though, quickly lost interest in showing me the toys when he saw a few cute girls wandering around. He tried to drag me off with him, but at 9, I really had no interest in girls. Instead, he agreed to let me stay in the toy aisle. While he went off to flirt, I was looking at some He-Man toys when I noticed a man come skulking into the aisle. He stared at me the whole time, too. I didn't really think much about it at first. I figured he could be there to buy something for his kids. He was looking at the toys at the far end of the aisle, but every now and then, he'd covertly glance over to me, then go back to pretending to look at the toys. I noticed he kept creeping closer and closer to me, following that same pattern. I guess I should have been more alarmed, but I really didn't think I was in any danger. I had been by myself in the Kmart quite often before. The man slowly crept closer and closer. He would pick up a toy, look at it for a bit, then put it down and take a step closer. Once he was right beside me, he picked up a Skeletor toy, then turned to me. "Hey kid, do you have a Skeletor?" "No, I don't." He showed the toy to me. "Well, want me to buy it for you? Just come up to the registers and I'll buy it for you." I shook my head again. "No thank you, I'm supposed to wait here for my brother to come back." Don't worry about it, kid. I can buy the toy for you and get you back here before your brother even knows you're gone." Uncomfortable, I again shook my head. I really shouldn't, but thank you anyway. The guy didn't give up, however. He seemed really intent to get me to go with him. I kept wishing my brother would come back to the toy aisle, or at least that another adult would come and help me. This man would not leave me alone. It got worse. He kept inching closer and closer to me, and eventually wrapped his hand on my shoulder. My immediate impulse was to jerk away from him, but I stopped when I felt him put his arm on my back. I felt him press an object, which I assumed to be a knife, directly into the small of my back. I'm surprised I didn't piss myself right then and there. I was scared to death, and I wanted to run, but I was certain if I tried, the man would kill me with his knife. "Well, you could have at least had a toy," the man told me. "Now you're gonna come with me, and you're not gonna make a sound if you don't want this knife in your neck." The man pushed me forward, and I had to walk forward with him. It was difficult. My entire body felt fuzzy and weird. I couldn't even feel my hands or my feet. I began to cry a little bit, and this angered the man. "You better hold those tears in, or you're gonna be in some real pain." He made his point by pressing the tip of the blade, which was concealed in the sleeve of his jean jacket, further into my back. I didn't think I was going to die, at least not yet. I did think, though, that this man was surely going to take me away. I would never see my family again, and I had no idea what he would do to me before he killed me. There was no doubt in my mind that he would eventually kill me, though. I didn't want to cry because I didn't want him to hurt me, but I was so scared that I just couldn't help it. Tears began to fall down my cheeks. I was then hit from behind, and I fell hard onto the ground. I started bawling because I thought the man must have gotten pissed off at me. He must have stabbed me or something. Through the tears, though, I saw my 15-year-old brother suddenly on top of the man who had been kidnapping me, absolutely beating the shit out of him. He had tackled the man from behind and was completely pounding his face into a pulp. Some security guys rushed over shortly and pulled my brother off of the guy. He explained pretty quickly, though, that the creeper was trying to kidnap me. Security took my brother, me, and the kidnapper into their back office, and then they paged my mother. The man was arrested quickly and was eventually convicted. My brother probably saved my life, but he still got in trouble for leaving me alone to begin with. Even though my mom was pissed off at him, and I guess I should have been too, I was really just appreciative of what he'd done in the end. When I was in high school, I tended to spend a lot of time over at my best friend Tim's house. He lived on the other side of the neighborhood. After school, I would walk back to his house with him, and we would play video games all evening and well into the night. Then, when it got pretty late, I would walk back home across the neighborhood. I lived in a small town, so although there weren't really many people out late at night when I was walking, I never got too worried. It was a small town, and nothing bad ever happens in a small town, right? So, walking home at night alone was no big deal. One day in the fall, though, it became a very big deal. It normally took me about half an hour to walk from Tim's house to my own. I had to walk up through the main street of town, which was generally pretty deserted. All the stores and all the shops closed down around 5 or 6 in the evening. Occasionally, though, I would see someone while walking home. It was never anyone I was worried about, usually a teenager or an older woman, for example. But on this day, as I walked over the train tracks by the post office, I saw someone sitting in the middle of the parking lot of the post office, just sitting on the ground. He was wearing a hoodie, and I couldn't really get a good look at him. I was looking, though. I guess I looked too long, because he caught me looking at him. I quickly averted my gaze, as people often do when caught looking at someone else. I didn't think it was a big deal. I mean, that sort of thing happens all the time, right? I did begin to slightly worry a bit when the man sprang to his feet and began walking out of the parking lot and toward the sidewalk in a hurry. Fortunately, though, he was across the street from me. Unfortunately, he was staring directly at me as I walked along. Unnerved, I began to go a bit faster. As I did, though, the man across the street began to go faster as well. He was now glaring at me and keeping pace with me. At no point did he actually try to cross the street, though. He just kept pace. The road through town was quite a long one, and our semi-encounter had happened at the very beginning of the road. I actually had to walk the length of the road and then make a right turn when the road ended, but it seemed obvious that this man was either following or at least trying to follow me. I decided to take a bit of a gamble and take a left turn on an earlier road. If I did, I could walk around the block and still eventually get to where I was going. It was down a darker street than the main road, but now there was a chance I could at least lose the man. When I got to the spot where I wanted, I made a sudden turn and walked down that road. A quick glance behind me showed that the man had just continued to walk forward. I was relieved that he hadn't followed me. I didn't even mind that the road I was now on was much darker. After a bit more walking, I made it to the road I originally would have had to turn on anyway. There was no sign of the man, so I got to the sidewalk and made a turn to cross the road. Out of the corner of my eye, though, I suddenly saw the man come sprinting at me from around the side of a building. I immediately knew that he had headed me off at the path, so to speak. Unfortunately, he'd caught me by surprise. He tackled me to the ground. He didn't hit me, though. He held me to the ground and pinned me in place. He smelled revolting, and he had this insane look in his eyes. As I sat there, struggling to get away, he held me down with no problem like the Hulk. Then he began to spit in my face. He began raving like a lunatic, telling me that I thought I was better than him, that I didn't know what it was like to have a rough life. He also kept calling me JJ for some reason, and talking to me like he knew who I was. I couldn't get away from this man. He was so much bigger and stronger than me. He had the leverage too, plus I was panicking. He wrapped his hand around my neck and began to strangle me. I struggled, and he began to shake me against the pavement. My head slammed into it, and hit it again and again. Eventually, I lost consciousness. Next thing I knew, I was suddenly in the hospital. Apparently, I'd been found in a pool of my own blood on the sidewalk. The man who attacked me was nowhere to be found. I had a severe concussion, and my shoulder was fractured as well. All I could guess was that maybe this crazy guy thought he'd killed me or something and ran away in a hurry. I had a long recovery psychologically. Although I never saw the man again, I thought I saw him all the time. I thought I'd see him every time I went for a walk. I'd imagine seeing him looking into my bedroom window every night. I always thought he was there watching me, and each time I could have swore I really saw him. Sometimes I still see him even today. When I was 17, my best friends and I were big fans of the show Jackass. We liked to make up strange dares for each other to do. However, we really didn't do a lot of the painful stuff they did on that show. We usually were just much more likely to dare each other to do scary things or play stupid pranks on other people. A lot of the time, I was able to duck the more risky dares by not daring my friends to do anything too severe in turn. This strategy, of course, could not last forever, and soon my friends noticed I never really did anything scary as they did. So, they dared me to spend 2 hours by myself in the middle of the local graveyard in the middle of the night. I tried to shrug it off like it was no big deal, but in actuality, I had always been really freaked out by graveyards. I guess I didn't really believe that strongly in the supernatural, but even without that aspect, they were already creepy places to be in. I mean, just knowing that you were walking on the ground and dead bodies were buried everywhere underneath you, that should be enough to freak anybody out, really. Anyway, the dare was that I had to go into the graveyard at midnight and stay there until 2 a.m. exactly. I had to go deep into the graveyard too. I couldn't take a flashlight, but I could have my cell phone on me, which would provide a little bit of light. My friends all waited at the gate, and I went pretty deep out into the cemetery. It was creepy and extremely quiet. All in all, though, I thought I had it pretty easy. When I knew I was way out of my friends' sights, I found a place to sit down. I stared at my watch and realized I was just 10 minutes into the dare. I sat down and tried to keep myself company. After a while, I began to hear some sounds that weren't too uncommon. It sounded as if animals were scurrying around on the leaves. Occasionally, I would hear the sound of a twig breaking or something. It was very unnerving, but it was not anything I couldn't explain. After a while, however, I suddenly heard an extremely loud snap off in the distance. I jumped up to my feet just from the sheer surprise. When I did, I looked over in that direction, only to see the outline of a man standing a bit away from me right by a gravestone. It was impossible in this lighting to tell if he was looking my direction or not, but I knew that if I could see him, it was completely conceivable he could also see me. I didn't get too worried though. Actually, my first thought was that this was likely one of my friends trying to scare me. They probably figured there was nothing to really be scared of in a graveyard, circled around me, thinking they'd give me something to be scared of instead. Come on, guys, this is so lame. I called out to the man. I wasn't sure which one of my friends it was, as there were 6 of us all together. "Oh, I'm so scared." The figure of the man began to move towards me. They didn't move too fast either. This, in my mind, confirmed it must be one of my friends. If it really was someone to worry about, someone who wanted to do me harm, would they have been walking so slowly and confidently towards me? I called out to the man a couple of more times as he slowly walked over. I called out the names of each one of my buddies, expecting I'd eventually correctly guess which one it was. There was no answer each time, so I finally remembered I had my cell phone with me. The light was not very bright, but I thought it might be just good enough to let me make out who this was. So I shined my light on the man. Immediately, I realized this was not one of my friends. I couldn't make out his features exactly, but from what I could see, this was not anyone I knew, or anyone I ever would know. But that wasn't the worst part. I caught the light of my cell phone glinting off something he was carrying in his hands. I knew it had to be a knife. I can't explain the feeling fully, but it felt like I was hit with a sudden electric shock. I didn't wait around though. I turned back in the direction I'd come from into the cemetery and ran like hell. It didn't take long before I could see my friends off in the distance, and I was calling to them to run. They didn't though. They all just looked around very confused. I was panting by the time I reached them, but when I looked back, the man was nowhere to be seen. I tried to explain to my buddies what happened, but no one believed me. They all thought I'd just chickened out on the dare and called me a wuss. Some of them even thought I was trying to turn the dare back on them. You know what though? I don't even really care. I'd rather be a living wuss than a dead brave guy. I don't believe in life after death. I also don't really see the point of graveyards myself. I personally think that once you die, you should be cremated, and that's that. However, even though these are my beliefs, I understand that cemeteries are important to other people, and thus they should be treated with the utmost of respect. When this happened to me, I didn't have a car. I walked to and from work. I didn't mind really, but I did have to walk through a cemetery in order to get to where I was going. It was a really huge cemetery as well, and would have taken me way too much time to simply walk around. Fortunately, it was completely open at night, and they had a paved path that led me all the way through it as well. One night, I was closing the restaurant I worked in, and I was going to be the last one to leave. We stayed open until 11 p.m., so it was nearly impossible to ever get out of the store by midnight. This night, it was considerably later even, so after I locked the store up, I immediately started to head home. As usual, I cut through the cemetery. I had done this so often by this point, there was nothing frightening about doing it at all, even in the middle of the night. About halfway through the cemetery though, something really odd caught my eye. I happened to notice a vehicle sitting somewhat down in one of the rows. It wasn't just resting on the path either, which was wide enough for a car to drive on. It was sitting directly across 2 graves. I thought this was pretty damn disgusting. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and the last thing I wanted was to trouble with anyone out there at night though, so I decided to go ahead and ignore it. When I got to the path right in front of the car, suddenly its headlights turned on. It immediately blinded me, because they were the high beams. Of course, it was very dark outside as well. It was such a sudden brightness that it actually hurt me. I quit walking and covered my eyes. Before I even knew what was going on, the car had turned on, and they started driving directly toward me. The lights were shining right on me, so there was no way this person didn't see I was right in their way. Although I was still blinded by the lights, and I hadn't been able to recover my sight yet, I was able to jump out of the way just barely before the car hit me. They drove on by, then turned around between 2 of the gravestones, and came back for me. It was just horrible. Not only was this person trying to hurt me, he was also haphazardly driving over and through other people's graves. He came back towards me, and I had to run out of the way again. The guy stopped now, fortunately. I was on foot, so I was able to figure out a way to weave between the graves and get away from the man. I had to break my own ethical code and walk amongst them. I went off the path and ran, jumping over the gravestones as I went. I felt icky as all hell doing this, but the car was not a big car. It wouldn't have stood a chance trying to run over so many gravestones to get me. The person tried to follow me on the path for a while though. It was extremely scary because I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I arrived at the entrance. I was afraid that whoever this was would have me cornered once I reached it and either run over me or get out of the car to finish their goal to kill me. Fortunately for me though, the luckiest thing to ever happen in my life happened. Across the entrance from the cemetery were 2 police cars with their lights flashing. They weren't there because of my ordeal though. Apparently, they were just finishing a domestic situation across the street. The presence of the cars was just enough to cause the car following me to stop and begin reversing very quickly. One of the officers saw me running at the entrance and intercepted me. They had seen the strange car, but by the time I explained to them what had just happened, the guy had already sped off. I guess maybe it's not the most bone-chilling story, but it was definitely very unnerving to me. Someone driving across the bed of graves, trying to kill me as well, constantly with their high beams on blinding me in the darkness. I couldn't make out any of the details of the car because of this either. I was so upset by this that I went out, bought a bicycle, and rode around the graveyard every time in the future. I'm sure there are moments in your life that when you think back on them later on, you tend to wish you had been able to do something different in that moment. This is one of the things that bugs me the most. A few Halloweens back, I was trying to find something new and scary to do. I know it seems a little cliche, but I thought I would explore a graveyard. I myself am definitely a believer in the supernatural, and thought that if there was any place I would be likely to see a ghost, it would surely be in the middle of a graveyard. I even brought a camera and other supplies with me, since I thought I would stay out there for a long time. I got my flashlight and set out to exploring. The ambiance was extremely creepy. I had never been in the graveyard at all, let alone during the night. For the first maybe 45 minutes or so, I jumped at every single sound and saw all sorts of weird and freaky shadows and shapes out of the corner of my eye. After about an hour though, the creep factor began to swiftly wear off, and although I was still quite interested, I was not creeped out anymore. I guess I had been silly, thinking that I really would see a ghost so soon. When I didn't, I was very disappointed. After a while though, I heard a loud noise. Then I heard a lot of rustling. When I looked off in that direction and shined my light, I saw a dirty old man sprinting right at me through the darkness. Scared, I tried to warn him that I was armed. I was not, but it quickly became apparent that he was not trying to hurt me. "Help me! Help me, please!" the man called out as he caught up to me. He was very nasty looking and smelled nasty as well. I figured he was a homeless person who was living in the cemetery. I wanted to get away from him at first, and informed him I didn't have any money. "I don't need money! Someone is trying to kill me! Please, help me!" Honestly, I didn't believe the man at first. I just wanted him to get away from me. But still, I couldn't just leave him there. I asked him who it was that was trying to kill him. He was unable to give me any specifics. He said he hadn't even seen who was after him. He just knew that someone was trying to kill him. By that point in time, I had been around the entire graveyard, though. I knew there wasn't anyone in it but me and him. I didn't know what this man wanted, but I was positive there was no one trying to kill him. I shone my flashlight around just to appease him and let him know I could not see anyone there but us. I told him I had to be on my way and started to walk away. He would have none of it, though. The man began to follow me, just raving on and on like a lunatic. I was convinced by this point that he was either a paranoid schizophrenic or having some sort of mental breakdown. I tried to get away from him, but he grabbed onto my arm and roughly tried to pull me back. I'd had enough by this point. I hauled off, knocking the guy down to his butt. I told him I didn't know what his game was, but he was going to stay the hell away from me, or he would have a big problem. While he was sitting on the ground, still carrying on, I turned and ran, making my way swiftly out of the graveyard. The following day, I was driving to work when I noticed something that scares the hell out of me to this very day. I'd seen many funeral processions driving into the graveyard in order to bury a dead body, but this was the first time I had ever seen an ambulance outside a cemetery, and they were loading a gurney into it as well. A gurney with a closed-up body bag in it. It was the first time I'd ever seen a dead body being taken out of a cemetery. Now, obviously, I didn't see the body itself, but there weren't really many options of who it could have been. Either the homeless guy really was telling me the truth, and someone did kill him that night, or I was right about the homeless guy being a dangerous lunatic, and he'd killed someone else who happened upon the graveyard that night as well. Either way, either prospect is way too scary for me. I've never walked through that graveyard, let alone at night ever again. This is one of my strangest stories. I'm not sure if it will scare anyone who hears it, but it was extraordinarily creepy when it happened. Growing up, I had a best friend named Bobby. We grew up in the same neighborhood, basically. We began playing together at such an early age that I can't even really remember when it was. We were friends before we even started kindergarten, though I do have some blurry memories of that first day. We always got put in the same classes as we advanced through the grades as well. He was easily my best friend, and we did everything together. We both started watching horror movies at a pretty young age, much younger than anyone should probably be watching them. But don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those people who blame their problems on scary media. And I also in no way feel that they eventually influenced his actions. But we watched all of the scary movies. I'd have to say that our personal favorites had to be the Freddy Krueger films. I wish they had YouTube back in the day. Maybe the sheer content of horror videos here might have changed the way things ended up. I say that because we burned through all the movies at the store several times. Bobby started looking for something else to satisfy his hunger for horror, and the thing he turned to was serial killers. He became completely obsessed with them. It was one thing to read about them in books or old newspaper articles, but Bobby took it to what I felt were very unhealthy levels. Around this time, there was a bit of a boom in serial killer entertainment in the world. At the comic book store that we went to, they began selling books that were supposedly depictions of serial killer crimes. If that wasn't bad enough, they even had serial killer trading cards. Now, Bobby really wanted me to share in his newest obsession. I tried for the sake of my friend, but it's one thing to watch horror movies where people aren't really being killed. It's quite another to read about supposedly depicted real-life murders, or to collect special cards that list real murderers on the back as if they're baseball statistics. I just couldn't do it. And that began the first separation that me and my best friend ever experienced. Bobby took his interest pretty far. When we'd hang out, we used to do silly things. We'd play pretend that one of us was Freddy Krueger and the other one was Jason Voorhees. But now he wanted to pretend to be Jeffrey Dahmer and tie me down to portray one of his victims. I don't recall the names of any of them, and I really don't want to look it up, but Bobby knew all of them by heart. I just couldn't do that. The idea of doing it felt 100% wrong. Even writing it down feels wrong. Bobby was involved in the trading service at the time, which was advertised in his comic books. This was a few years before the prevalence of the internet. He used it to get these VHS copies of interviews with serial killers. I remember sitting through televised interviews with Ted Bundy and Bobby's personal favorite, Charles Manson. I guess he liked him particularly because he never really killed anyone himself. He influenced others to do his dirty work for him. For some reason, Bobby found that especially fascinating. He began to refer to Charles Manson as his idol. Most people, when he said that to them, just laughed because they thought he was being silly. I never laughed, though. I was the only one privy to all the information I'm telling you about, so I knew just how serious he really was. Now that doesn't mean I thought that Bobby would ever actually kill anyone. Our friendship sort of fell apart though. The last time I spent the night at Bobby's house, we were both 14 at the time. The serial killer obsession had been going on for at least a year at that point. I was so sick of it. I brought over a Nightmare on Elm Street marathon collection I thought we could watch together. It had been a while since we'd seen them. Needless to say, Bobby was pretty annoyed with me, but I was pretty firm that this whole thing had been going on way too long. He relented, and we began to watch the movies together. I wish I could say we had a good time, but we didn't talk at all during the movies. We just sat there, and Bobby kept giving me this weird stare. I could see him through the corner of my eye. I never looked over to acknowledge him, but I knew he could tell I was nervous and that I was trying my best to avoid looking at him. Movie after movie, he just sat there and stared at me the whole time. We watched the movies with the lights off as well. He was on the love seat and I was on the couch. When we got late into the night, I got tired. I laid down, and sometime during the course of one of the movies, I fell asleep. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep, but when I woke up once again, the TV was off, and it was pitch black in the room. I blinked a couple of times to get the sleep out of my eyes, and then I noticed a black figure sitting on the coffee table in front of me. I was startled. I began to move to get up, and when my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw that it was Bobby. He was wide awake, sitting on the coffee table 2 feet away from me, with his eyes bulging out of his head. He had a blank expression on his face, and there was no hint of emotion at all. I tried to ask him if something was wrong, but he wouldn't answer me. He just stared at me. I told him he was scaring me. He didn't respond still. It was then I noticed something in his hand. My heart jumped when I recognized it as his pocket knife. I jumped off the couch and asked him what was wrong. He just sat there and looked at where I had been sitting, staring blankly. That was too much for me. I had to get out of that house. I didn't even take the movies with me. I just told Bobby I was leaving. He didn't respond, and I guess I really didn't give him much a chance to. I had to get out. That was the last time Bobby was my best friend. We stopped talking altogether after. The two friends who'd begun kindergarten together did not begin high school together. I saw him in the hallway from time to time, but I never stopped to talk to him. He began hanging out with some burnouts. I recall them starting a band or something. He stopped going to high school when he was 16 and ran away from home. That was back in the early 1990s, and I've never seen him since. Now I want to end this story by saying I don't believe that Bobby really became a serial killer or anything. I would be extremely surprised if he ever actually hurt anyone. There's no psychological evidence that collecting serial killer cards or reading true crime comic books can change the basic fundamentals of a man's psyche and cause him to commit murder. I don't think Bobby actually wanted to kill me that night either. He just got himself a bit obsessed with darkness and completely immersed himself in that life. It's not healthy, regardless of how you want to look at it. I hope he's okay though, wherever he is, and I hope he was able to put all that darkness behind him. This is a short story that happened to me several years ago, but still affects me to this day. Now, objectively speaking, this may not be the most scary story you've ever heard, but the image is surely burned into my mind and is something I don't think I'll ever forget. School had just ended 3 weeks prior, and my friend and I were hanging out enjoying a surprisingly beautiful summer night. I live in a very quiet little town. There never really is much commotion, or really much of anything going on at all. We have one main school, and our graduating class is tiny compared to most others. Around midnight, we'd gotten pretty sick of playing games, and wanted to try something different. He suggested walking around outside to enjoy the beautiful clear summer night. Without much hesitation, I agreed. It was after midnight in a quiet town, so I figured not much could possibly go wrong. My parents were already asleep, but they trusted me anyway, so sneaking out just to walk probably wouldn't have been a huge issue. We ended up staying out for a couple of hours. We talked about movies, wrestling, what our plans for the rest of the summer would be. Up to this point, it had actually been one of my favorite nights in a long time. Just enjoying the nice breeze, the moonlight, and having a wonderful conversation with my good friend. We were already on our way back home, and probably only about 5 minutes away from my house. We were walking down an extremely dark street. On the right side were some old houses, where 95% of the lights were off, and to our left was only trees with no streetlights at all. My friend pointed out as we were walking that some of the sparse light that was visible was hitting the trees and looked almost like a person. We laughed at first, and were kind of amazed at how much it really did look like a person was there. After a moment more of observation, though, the laughter swiftly faded away as we realized that this was not just a shadow. Like the fools that we were, we decided to explore. I pulled back a few branches and saw that there was actually a woman standing there. She had this huge, disturbing smile on her face. She was old, probably in her 70s, I would guess. The weirdest thing is, she was dressed completely normal and had lots of nice jewelry on as well. She looked exactly like how my grandma would dress for holiday parties. She was just standing there, in the brush, still as a statue, and smiling at us. For a moment, we were just stood there in shock and surprise. In a split second, her smile vanished, and she jumped out, screaming at us and beginning to chase us. We started to run as fast as we could back to the house. When I turned to look back, to my knowledge, she didn't continue to follow us any further. She just stood there with that disturbing smile. I know most people might not find that particularly scary, but in the middle of the night when you find a creepy old lady hiding in the trees and watching you, it really rattles your cage. Nothing else of note came from this incident, but as I mentioned previously, I'll never be able to get the image of her smiling and suddenly screaming and chasing us out of my head. I remember being a teenager and really enjoying those first few weeks of summer break. Sleeping in, staying up late, hanging out with friends, basically just enjoying being out of school and not having to worry about homework or teachers or responsibilities. On this specific night, my parents were out of town for their anniversary. My friend James was coming over for the night, and my brother, who was 20 at the time, was supposed to be there to look after us. It was only for one night after all. Around 1 a.m., James just happened to look out the window and see there were two people standing outside in the middle of the road. They appeared to be looking in through the windows and staring at us. We told my brother, who then decided to go take a look outside. The people had started taking pictures, and it looked like they were snapping photos of us and the inside of our house. My brother really didn't take any of this kind of crap. He went outside and started to yell at the two from our front steps. When he got a bit closer, he could see it was a man and a woman, probably in their 20s, he would guess. The man didn't say anything, but the woman called out, "Oh, we're sorry. We're just trying to take a picture of the moon. It really is beautiful." My brother said he didn't care, and they needed to leave right now. She insisted that he come down there with them and look at the moonlight. Then he would understand. After a brief verbal scuffle, my brother then said, "If you guys don't get out of my property right now, I'm going to make you." He started to approach the couple. Once my brother went further into the street, though, the man who was standing in the road rushed up and smacked him right in the head. James and I sat there in disbelief. We didn't know what to do. Clearly, we were only young teenagers, and this guy was attempting to attack my brother. James called the police and explained what was happening. I was having a panic attack, worrying what to do. I looked again, and the man was now kicking him fiercely. The woman stood there, laughing, and seemed to be enjoying it. I covered my eyes, and that's when I heard her suddenly yell, "Run!" My neighbor from across the street ran out with a baseball bat. He didn't connect with the man, but he did try to swing at him. They ran off quickly, and were out of sight in a moment. The man helped my brother up and helped him to the door. The cops showed up a few minutes later, and we all gave our statements. Of course, there was nothing that could really be done, because none of us could get a good look at the couple in the darkness. Writing this as an adult, I still get a sick feeling in my stomach every time I see the moon on a warm summer night. So the events of this story happened to me several years ago, during the last vacation my family and I ever took during summer break. Every year, we used to drive a couple hours away from my hometown to a beautiful tourist area near the ocean with lots of great seafood. This year was no different really. We decided to leave in the middle of the night when my dad got off work. That meant we would arrive by 7 a.m. and have the entire day to spend at the ocean. The first part of the trip was great actually. I slept for a bit, as did my sister and mom. I live on the northeastern coast of the United States, so for a huge stretch of that trip, it was just trees and mountains. Of what I could see, it was actually very relaxing and soothing to try and sleep to. A little after 3 a.m. though, I was suddenly awoken by my dad, who was loudly shouting some curse words. I asked him what was wrong, and he said in an almost nervous voice, "It's okay, honey, go back to sleep." Without asking any other questions, I closed my eyes. Almost immediately, though, my eyes shot open again because my dad was swerving the car erratically. I thought my sister was going to go flying out the window. This is when things started to take a turn for the worse. My mom woke up and yelled at my dad, and that's when we found out what was really happening. My dad told us there had been a Jeep of some kind behind us for about an hour. They were riding right on our tail, and every time my dad tried to switch lanes, they would do so as well. This was in the time before cell phones were hugely popular, so we had no way to contact the police. We decided to stop at the next rest area and call the authorities. We saw a sign that said it would be coming in 2 miles. That seemed like forever away now, though, that we knew that whoever this was really messing with us. If they had truly been following us for an hour, then this was more than just some joke. They definitely intended to harm us. The 2 miles came by, and we pulled into the 24-hour rest area. We pulled in right out front, and the Jeep still followed us in. I had never been so scared in my entire life. My mom, sister, and I got out of the car to go inside and call the police, while my dad tried to defend himself. I'll never forget what I saw when I stepped out. It was a navy blue Jeep, and had 5 people inside. They all were wearing white masks that had different smiling artwork on them. All 5 people got out of the car and stood there staring at my dad. One of the figures looked like they were holding a weapon, but I honestly couldn't be sure. I still can't believe the luck of what happened next. A patrol car just happened to pull in that exact moment, and the masked people rushed back into their Jeep and drove off. We flagged the cop down and explained what had happened. We all gave our statement as well. We ended up staying at the rest stop until dawn and continued with the rest of our trip during the day. I wish I could explain the full horror to you of seeing that car full of people with those masks on. Why the hell would they follow us for an entire hour if they were just trying to scare the shit out of us? And what would have happened if that patrol car didn't show up at that exact moment? So I might have a different perspective on summer than most of you. I usually hated the summer. My parents both worked during the day, and that left me to do all the chores every single freaking day. I hated it. My friends were all out doing everything they wanted, while I had to do house and yard work. One particular day, I was tasked with painting the spindles on the front porch, which would probably even take more than 1 full day to do. While I was out there painting, I heard the loudest noise coming from the street. It sounded like someone was rolling a tool chest down the road or something. I looked over and saw an old guy with a cart that had a bunch of what looked like tools on it. After looking further and putting 2 and 2 together, it appeared to be a portable cart to sharpen knives. Having some extra cash and thinking I would do something nice for my parents, I flagged the man down. I ran inside and grabbed the knife block to bring out the knives to be sharpened. I told the man I was doing it for my parents. He looked over at me and whispered in my ear, "Such a nice boy." He completed the sharpening for me, and I gave him the cash. He thanked me and continued down the road, slowly but surely. When my parents got home, I could tell they really appreciated the gesture. I think, though, they were more focused on the painting and how good of a job I'd surprisingly did. That night, I slept in my living room so I could stay up and watch TV without waking my parents up. I had to pause the TV at one point, though, because I began to hear a weird, loud noise. I moved the blinds near the couch and looked outside. I saw that exact same cart from earlier. What the fuck? I looked around, but all I could see was the cart. The man was nowhere to be found. It seemed my dog could tell something was up, though. As I went to turn the back porch light on and let her out, though, I could have sworn I just saw someone shuffle behind the garage. I freaked out, rushed to my dad, and told him what I thought I'd seen. He looked out front and did see the cart, but when he went behind the garage, he didn't find anything. I went to the side door to make sure it was locked, only to find the old man staring directly against it and staring into our home. I screamed for my dad. He ran and came out and confronted the man. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he was yelling like he never had before, shouting expletives all over the place. He called the cops right away, and the cops eventually showed up. They took statements and took the man, who was surprisingly still there, away. I think he was charged with trespassing or something along those lines. It's been years since these events have taken place, and the only thing I can still really visualize are those spindles on the front porch and the old man's face pressed against the side door when I went to go look at it. I don't think I'll ever forget that image, as much as I'd really like to. Anyway, I hope that story spooked a few of you out there. And if not, I hope it at least was a good one to fall asleep to. Summer break is an awesome time to kick back, relax, and even enjoy some traveling. Unfortunately for me, my summer break did not consist of vacationing or kicking back at all. My old roommate Dave was going on vacation with his fiancée, and so he asked me to take care of his golden retriever Millard. Always trying to make a quick buck myself, I quickly accepted. I planned on staying overnight with Millard while Dave would be gone for a couple of nights. Feeling lonely, I asked some of my friends to come over and hang out for a while. We sat outside, ate some wings, and just hung out for a couple hours. I had to work at 6:30 in the morning though, so I kicked them all out at around 11 and decided to go get ready for bed. I put on the TV and made myself comfortable on the living room couch. I started to doze off, and while I was going in and out of sleep, I suddenly heard the doorbell ring. I kind of jolted awake and sat still for a moment. I thought perhaps it was only the TV. Maybe I just woken myself up thinking it was the actual doorbell. That was quickly proven false though, when the doorbell began to ring over and over again. My heart was practically jumping out of my chest. I grabbed my watch and saw it was close to midnight. Who the hell could possibly be at the door at this hour of night? I slowly approached as the bell continued ringing. I could see there was a shady-looking man outside with a backwards ball cap on. He had a big brown bag in his hand as well. I opened the front door a crack while still keeping the chain on. I didn't open the screen door either. I quickly asked the man what he wanted. In a very soft, unconvincing tone, he said this: "Hi, I have your food delivery here." I immediately yelled that I didn't order any food. He proceeded to say my address and then followed with, "That is your address, right? I have your delivery right here." More annoyed than anything else, I told him once more he had the wrong house and slammed the door in his face. I then turned all the lights off. The house I was staying in was a split-level ranch. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's kind of like having a 1.5-story house. The basement is usually a living room, and not completely underground either. The windows are about eye level. I went to check on the basement part of the house and was looking out the front windows. The man was just sitting in his car, the car not on, and still parked in my driveway. I was a little bit spooked at this point, so I called my brother to tell him what happened. He told me not to worry too much, and it was probably just some kind of mistake. I agreed and went to check back out the window, only to see the car was still there in the driveway. but the man was no longer inside. I grabbed the dog and locked myself in Dave's bedroom. She barked and growled all night long. I'm not sure if it was because she could hear things outside or because she was stuck in the room with me. I hardly slept a wink that night, and when it was time for me to leave for work, I got ready in the bedroom, then ran out of the house as fast as I could. I had a brief moment of relief when I noticed the car was no longer in the driveway. That soon changed, however, when I turned the corner and saw the car was now parked at the side of the road. I went to work terrified. I blasted my friends that day, asking them if this was some kind of practical joke. They assured me, though, that it was not them. I came back to feed Millard after work with one of my friends, and we noticed footprints circling the house and scratches on the siding where one of the back windows was. It looked like someone had tried to scare me, or perhaps actually tried to break in and had simply been unsuccessful. In hindsight, I realized I probably should have gotten the license plate number, but I just thought I was maybe being paranoid. I could have also asked what company they represented so I could call to see if it was a real order or not. When Dave returned, I brought this event up to him, and he said he'd never had an experience like this. Maybe it was simply a fluke. Maybe the delivery person was pissed they got pranked and now stuck with the bill and decided to take revenge. Or perhaps I was in some real danger. Either way, this is one summer night I still bring up to my friends when they want to hear a freaky story. I'll try to tell this story to the best of my ability, but as my friends could tell you, I have a terrible memory. Some details may be weird because of this. This happened to me when I was 14 years old, and I'm now 27. It was summer break. I can remember it because I was extremely bored and felt like I could literally die from boredom at any moment. My parents went to work every morning, and because of this, I was left home alone to do the chores. I was a trustworthy kid, though, so my parents allowed me to do so. The only two rules were to never leave the house and to not use the oven by myself. I lived in a really nice area, other than one extremely old, ugly house on the corner. The house was covered with vines and all sorts of unkempt landscaping everywhere. Well, one summer day, my 14-year-old self thought it was a good idea to go and check out this house. It was during the day, too, so I didn't figure anything could really go wrong. I wanted to see the inside. I wasn't going to steal or anything, I just wanted to see what it looked like. Every day when we used to get off the bus, we would always tell stories about this house being haunted and other spooky stuff like that. Well, when I finally saw my friends again after break, I wanted to tell them about my bravery of going inside the house. I got all black clothes on and thought I was being super sneaky. It was around 12 in the afternoon though, so I probably stood out like a sore thumb and looked like a moron. I approached the front of the house and was surprised to see the door was actually locked. I banged on the door for a second and was able to easily jimmy the lock. I opened the door and my excitement quickly vanished when I was greeted by an elderly man holding a knife toward my face. He looked so old that I almost thought he was a ghost or something. He had a long white beard and Albert Einstein-looking hair. He was wearing a thick red flannel despite it being summer. As soon as I had a split second to process this man holding a knife to my face, I turned and ran as fast as I could. I heard him yell out after me, "That's it, you're dead." I of course had no idea what he meant by that. My 14-year-old heart was beating out of my chest. I was in amazement that somebody actually lived there. I was starting to panic that I was going to get arrested for breaking in. My parents were going to kill me, and I was going to be in so much trouble. Well, sure enough, several minutes later, the police showed up at my house, and my parents were called right away. The cop was really nice, and I explained to them that I thought it was just an abandoned house. What got me in trouble was that old man said I had been terrorizing him for weeks. In truth, that was the first time I'd ever been there, though. According to the old man, he said he'd been hearing my footsteps downstairs in his kitchen when he was trying to sleep. Luckily, I was only 14 and had my parents to defend me and say that was obviously not true. Fast forward about a week. I was grounded for just about my entire life, but most of the dust had now cleared. That was until my doorbell rang. It was the cops again. I explained that I had been home the entire day and luckily my dad was off that day, and he was there to back up my story. Upon further investigation into the matter, the police found that somebody had been secretly living in the old man's crawlspace for weeks. At night, this person would sneak out, steal the man's food, and use the restroom. The day I broke in, he was suspicious because he'd been hearing a lot of noise the previous night, and when he saw me, he assumed I must be the intruder. The man actually came to talk to my dad and thanked me for breaking in because it helped him figure out what was really going on. So, yeah, I had a great story to tell my friends. Sad thing was, I was grounded for the remainder of the summer and was going to have to wait for school to tell them.